Anyway, guys, welcome to the Pulse of Miami Church. I recognize everybody in here. I don't need to introduce myself. By the way, good to have Jose and Stephanie back, so give them a round of applause. So really good to have them back. Today we're going to kind of get into a new chapter in the story of the Old Testament. In fact, it's not just a new chapter, it's a new book called First Kings. But I say a new chapter because we're going to kind of closing the chapter on King David, and we're opening a new chapter on his son, King Solomon. Now, it's not going to be anywhere near as long as, the story of David was. But we're going to get into some stuff. Now, today I'm very, very excited about this story because I'm going to make you a promise. If you've never heard this story before today, you will never forget this story for the rest of your life. Okay? I know that because I actually remember hearing this story when I was a little kid. And I actually remember this story so much so that I actually prayed a prayer that day, and that was the day that my life changed forever. Okay? It was about salvation. It was about a different decision that I made based on this, and I will never, ever forget this story for the rest of my life. And I guarantee you, if you've already heard this story, you will not have forgotten it, even if you've only heard it once. Okay? So it's a fascinating, fascinating story. It's going to be in First Kings chapter 3. But before we get there, I want to open with a question. If God granted you one prayer, what should it be? Okay, so it's kind of on the wish, but I didn't want to say wish, one prayer. If God said, okay, I'm going to give you one prayer where I'm not going to say no to you, which I'm going to be honest with you is kind of scary, right? I think God says no to me like when it's not good for me. But if you could wish for anything, or if you could pray for anything, and God would grant it to you, what would it be? What's that?
Be skinny.
Be skinny. I like that. I like that. Me too, sister. Me too. All right. Interestingly enough, some of us perhaps would say wealth, right? I think the lottery is up to $150 million. And then there's there's another power mega thing that's like 1 point something billion. That's crazy. God, you don't have to do a huge miracle. Just help me win the lottery, right? Right? That's not that big of a deal, right? The money's already there, right? Some of us may, instead of that, maybe our big wish or our big prayer would be for honor and respect. I don't get no respect in this life, right? It would be nice to have some people respect me. Or perhaps it would just be, man, I wish I was really, really smart. If one prayer, what should that one prayer be? Because he didn't see that. I got to change that. All right. So let's kind of open up to 1 Kings chapter 3 as we try to answer this question. Now, let me kind of catch you up with what happened in 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. It's kind of important to connect David into King Solomon. Okay, I'm skipping over this because it's kind of it's interesting, but there's not really a whole lot of lessons in it. It's just kind of what happened, and it's very Game of Thrones-esque. So if you're into like Game of Thrones kind of stories, read 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. It'll fascinate you. But I'll give you kind of the overall synopsis. David was so old that he was basically bedridden, and so King Solomon was supposed to be the next king over Israel, but he had an older brother who was the next brother under Absalom, and he basically said, "Well, I should be king and not King Solomon, or not Solomon." And so he started to rally people, and some of the big names that he got was Joab. Remember Joab? The problematic guy that he would try to do the right thing, but he would always kind of do it in a crooked, evil way, and he stabbed people in the stomach. Okay, so he got Joab on his side, the commander of the army. He got the high priest Abinadab on his side, And so they started to kind of rally people around him. And so word got back to David. And so David says to not king yet, Solomon, I want you to go with these people and I want you to make an announcement that you are the king. Okay? And he says, here's my advice to you. After that, if anybody else tries to usurp your authority, you're going to have to take care of it. That's number one. Number two, you need to kill Joab. He says, you can't trust him. He stabbed 2 people in the stomach. The sin is on his head, and I do not want that sin to be on my family's name. He says, I could have never done it because he was kind of faithful to me, but now he's already been unfaithful to you. You need to kill Joab. And number 3, you need to depose, get rid of the high priest Abinadab. So sure enough, Solomon goes. They crown him king. His brother says, oops, I'm sorry. I won't do it again. And then in the very next chapter, he's trying to do a sneaky way of making himself king. So he has his brother put to death. He has Joab put to death. And he has Abinadab deposed. So now, I want you to think about this. Solomon is a young man. Very, very young man. He now has the responsibility of the greatest kingdom in the entire world at that time on his shoulders. He's now run out of advice. He's followed all of his dad's advice, but from now on, all of the decisions have to come straight from him. And if I'm going to be honest, Solomon is scared. And so that's where we pick up the story in 1 Kings chapter 3. Starting in verse 4, it says, And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Now, I did a little bit of research. I found out that at this time, the tabernacle, which was the tent where they would meet with God, that was actually in Gibeon. Okay? The Ark of the Covenant was in Jerusalem, and they were waiting to build the Ark. But the place where you would worship God was still over here. And so there would come a day when all that's built, that all that stuff would come together. Right? But for right now, the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Why 1,000 burnt offerings? Number one, because he took worship of Yahweh very, very seriously. And number two, he was very wealthy and he could afford it. Okay? Verse 5. At Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, Ask what I shall give you. This is basically the same question that I posed to you. If you could have whatever you would want, what would you ask God for? Because God's basically saying to Solomon, I'll give you whatever you want, just ask for it. What will Solomon ask for? Verse 6. And Solomon said, Yahweh, you have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father. Why? Because he walked before you in faithfulness, righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you, and you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on this throne this day. Let me just kind of come out of the story and just kind of talk to you guys for a second. One of the greatest blessings that you could ever have is to be blessed by God. How do you do it? Be a righteous, upright person in your heart for the Lord, and the Lord will bless you. Okay, that's a good thing to kind of take out of this, right? But let's continue. Verse 7, Solomon continues. He says, And now, O Yahweh my God, you have made your servant, meaning me, king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Now, was he actually a child? No, he wasn't a child, but he's humbling himself, and he says, I'm so young. My father had all of this wisdom. Now I've run out of his advice. Now it has to come from me, and I don't know what I'm doing. Right? When he says, I'm but a child, I don't know how to come in and go out. What he's basically saying is, I don't know how to manage my own life. Right? And then in the next verse, He says, verse 8, and your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Man, I don't know how to handle my own life. How am I supposed to help to manage everybody else's life? And this is the greatest nation on the face of the planet at that time. And so here comes his request. Verse 9. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people? Scott, I just can I kind of change the words a little? I just need wisdom, because I want to govern and I want to take care of these people well. And I want you to remember that I may discern between good and evil. Remember that part. That's going to be really important a little bit later on. Verse 10. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. Why did this please the Lord? Verse 11. And God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Verse 12, behold, I now do according to your word. Okay? God is impressed with him. Why? Because what do most kings ask for? I want a long life. Right? Why? Because the lives of most kings are cut short because somebody else is trying to kill them all the time. So, give me a long life. Give me wealth. Give me honor, right? Or the life of my enemies. Right? Kill my enemies for me. That's what most kings ask for, but that's not what Solomon asked for. Solomon said, can you give me wisdom? Instead of asking for himself, he was asking for something that he could bless the people with. It wasn't a selfish request. It was a request that would help other people. So God says, I'm going to do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. In other words, God says, I will make you the wisest person to ever walk the face of the planet. That's a tall order. Verse 13, he says, I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all of your days. He says, Solomon, remember all the things that you could have asked for, but you didn't? Because you asked for wisdom so that you could govern the people well? Not only am I going to give you wisdom for that, but I'm also going to give you riches and honor. And on top of that, wait, there's more, right? Verse 14, and if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will even lengthen your days. I will even allow you to be a long-lasting king yourself. Wow. But then in verse 15 it says, and Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And I'm sure the question in Solomon's mind, and for those of us who are biblical readers and studiers, we should be asking the question, was this just a dream? Or did God really speak to him? That should be the question. Was this really, is this something he just kind of came up with in his head? So he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark. So he was at Gibeon. He went to the tabernacle, which is the tent where you would worship God. But then he comes back to Jerusalem where the ark of God is. And he does another, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings and made a feast for all of his servants. And then verse 16 happens. Then 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before them. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. As I was reading this, I had forgotten kind of how abruptly it kind of changes gears here. It's kind of funny. It's like the super spiritual, like, he has this dream and he speaks with God and these sacrifices and these holy places, and then two prostitutes, like just out of the blue, right? So just hang on to your seats. This story gets wild. This is not the first turn that this story is going to take, right? So the two prostitutes stand before him. Why were two prostitutes standing before him? Because there was a problem that they needed judgment between the two of them. Verse 17, the one woman said, "O my Lord," meaning she's talking to Solomon, "this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house." So, two women in a house, she gave birth, verse 18. "Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth." Okay? So they were pregnant at the same time. They had their babies 3 days apart. Here's the key. "And we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house. Only we two were in the house." So that's a key component to this story that she's telling Solomon. Is she's saying, we're prostitutes. We didn't have a whole bunch of family come over and visit and all that kind of stuff. The only two people who ever saw these two babies were her and I. Now this is where it gets interesting. So then, remember, this is her story. Verse 19, "And this woman's son died in the night because she laid on him." And I'm reminded of when our kids were young, actually, specifically Rebecca. Michelle was really, really concerned about having Rebecca in the bed with us because she was afraid that we might roll over in our sleep and hurt the baby, And I used to think she was crazy, and then I remember this story. I was like, maybe she's not crazy. It actually happens, right? So apparently that's what happens. The lady, she's accusing the other lady of rolling over in her sleep and accidentally killing her child. So verse 20, "And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept and laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast." I want you to think of what kind of a messed up person would do that? Like your instant reaction isn't like screaming in horror that your child has died. You're going to be like, "Oh, let me swap them out." Like, it's crazy. Verse 21, "When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had born." Which, it's a good thing it wasn't guys, because we can't tell the difference. Verse 22, "But the other woman said, 'No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours.' The first said, 'No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine.' Thus they spoke before the king." So they broke out in an argument right in front of this young King Solomon. Verse 23, "Then the king said, the one says, 'This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead.' And the other says, 'No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one.'" Now, before we move on, if you've never heard this story before, okay? For those of you who've heard this story, keep your mouth shut. If you've never heard this story before, I want you to imagine you're King Solomon. This is the first decision you have to make as king. There's two women. It's basically a she said, and there's a child. Right? Either the one lady's telling the truth about the other lady, and this lady is just evil. Or the lady that's being accused of being evil is actually the right one, and the other one is just crazy. She came up with this crazy story. And she obviously believes it. How do you figure out which one's telling the truth? How do you figure this one out? Verse 24, "And the king said, 'Bring me a sword.'" How's that going to answer the question there, king? So a sword was brought before the king. Verse 25. And the king said, divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other. What? What kind of solution is that? Obviously, it must have been a dream, because that is the stupidest idea I've ever heard in my entire life. Right? You're going to divide the baby in half? Now, remember, this is back during a rough time in history. I mean, this is not unheard of for a king back then to make these kinds of decisions. Let's read the next verse. Why would he say that? Verse 26. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. So verse 27, and the king answered and said, give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is the real mother. And Michelle doesn't like this story. I was actually talking with her yesterday. She's like, I don't believe it. What kind of a woman would do that? What kind of a woman would be like, yeah, go ahead and divide the baby. I'm cool with that. But I want to remind you that there is real evil. Remember what he asked for? He said, give me a discerning heart so I can determine good from evil. Right? I believe that this woman lived an angry, jealous life. And when she realized in the middle of the night that her baby was dead, because the whole thing about her getting pregnant and having a baby, she didn't want to be behind the other one. And so she was so jealous that the other one had a baby and she didn't. That was her motivation. It wasn't because she really wanted a baby. She just wanted the status of being a mother. And so her motivation was, I don't want her to be better than me. And so if the baby died, she wasn't attached to the baby. What does she care? And King Solomon was able to see through that. He was able to see, he had the wisdom. God gave him the wisdom to see the evil in this woman. In verse 28, and all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Man, it wasn't a dream. It wasn't just a dream. God had truly given him the wisdom that he had promised. Now, I told you were never going to forget this story. I guarantee you're never going to forget this story. That was such a crazy story, right? But if we go back to our question, and you should probably know the answer to this, if God granted you one prayer, what should it be? And I believe it should be this: seek wisdom and discernment, right? That should be what you do, okay? So if God gives you an option, ask him for wisdom. Why do I say that? In the New Testament, Paul actually was writing to one of the churches, and they had all these spiritual gifts. Okay, when you receive the Holy Spirit, you actually get a spiritual gift. And the spiritual gift that this one particular church, they were crazy about. They all wanted this one spiritual gift. And that was speaking in tongues. And they felt like, man, if somebody speaks in tongues, then they're super spiritual. Like only the super spiritual people get speaking in tongues, and it's so amazing, right? And so they were all gaga over it. And a bunch of people were jealous because they didn't have the gift of tongues. And Paul writes to them, he says, yeah, I mean, I have the gift of tongues. It's good, but I'd much rather you guys have the gift of prophecy. He says, in fact, if you're going to pray for something, pray for the gift of prophecy, because that builds up the church. Now, when we hear the word prophecy, we think that it's telling of the future. But what prophecy actually means is telling the truth of God. It's God's wisdom being told. And what Paul was saying is that you know what's better than some show-offy, type of spiritual gift where you speak in tongues. Speaking in tongues is still good. But he says, man, telling the truth of God, knowing the truth of God and sharing that with the church is so much more useful. Essentially, he was saying, seek wisdom and discernment. I remember being a kid, hearing this story as a little kid, and thinking to myself, I'd really like that. And I remember as a little kid getting and having a quiet moment with God and saying, you know what, God? I pray that you'd give me wisdom like you did to King Solomon. Maybe, perhaps, when I asked you if God granted you one prayer, what would it be? You thought to yourself, man, the lottery would be great, right? $1 billion? Are you kidding me? Even after you pay the taxes on it, it's probably only $1 million something. But still, right? That would be amazing. But here's one of the things that I've realized as I've gotten older in life. Remember I told you guys last week, money is a lot like a pet that doesn't want to be around you, right? Like it keeps running away from you. Money just runs away. It's always trying to run away from you, and it's really, really hard to get it to stay. Stay! No, it just runs away, right? If you win the lottery, the problem is that you haven't gained the wisdom on how to keep the wealth. And here's the problem. If you don't make the money through wisdom, it's going to run away. Ask just about every single lottery winner that has ever won the lottery. There's story after story after story that just a few years after they win an insane amount of money, they're worse off financially than they were before they won the money. Because the thing that matters more is the wisdom to be able to keep the money. Now, am I telling you that every single wise person that I've ever met in my life was a wealthy person? No. But that's because they didn't put their wisdom towards that part. They just chose to put wisdom towards the other part, and that's okay. But I'm going to tell you, if you were to pray and you were to ask God for wisdom and you would start seeking wisdom when it comes to finances, I guarantee you that God will bless your life when it comes to your finances. If when I asked you, if God granted you one prayer, what would it be? You thought to yourself, I'd like to have honor and respect. The way that this world gets honor and respect is through fear, through power, through credentialism, like having degrees. But I want to give you another option. What if you were to become a seeker of wisdom and discernment? And in the next 10 years, people around you started noticing that you were a person of wisdom. And they started coming to you for advice. I mean, wouldn't that be a position of honor and respect? Wouldn't you get exactly what you wanted if you were to have the wisdom to make other people's lives better? And seek wisdom and discernment. Don't make a vital mistake here. If after this sermon you go and you pray to God, you say, God, could you make me smart? You've missed what I've been trying to tell you. Okay? But there's a lot of smart people that are very messed up in life. Super smart. Super messed up. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. We were actually talking about this at the men's group the other day. I was kind of talking through it. Knowledge can be good and knowledge can also be bad, right? You can have the knowledge of the human anatomy and you could use that to heal somebody, or you could use it to know exactly where you want to stick the knife, right? You can know a lot about makeup and beauty, and so you could use that to help somebody who's feeling depressed about themselves feel better, or you could use that as an art of seduction. See, knowledge it could be good or it could be bad, but if you think of wisdom, wisdom is always thought of as a good thing. Because what wisdom essentially is it's knowledge applied to everyday life in a good way. That's what wisdom is all about. The smartest person that I had ever met in my entire life, and Raul knows him. He was a college-age student. He wasn't in college, but he was a college-age student that went to our youth ministry. Forget his name. But he was brilliant. I was actually going through seminary at the time. I was going through the fattest book that I had ever, and it was the most boring book. It's called Systematic Theology, right? And it was horrible. And I'm suffering through it, right? And I was carrying the book into church one day, and the kid saw it, and he was like, "Oh, I read that." And I was like, "Oh, you went to seminary?" He's like, "No, I just want to read it." And so that semester, as I wrote all my papers, I would actually call him and get advice on how to write this paper. I mean, it was amazing. Like, this guy was a genius. But you know what? Last time I saw him, he was a server at a pizza shop. Like, he wasn't even a server like at a high-end restaurant. He was a server at a pizza shop because he really, really liked smoking weed and eating pizza. Like that was his deal, right? So here's somebody who's brilliant, but he never applied it to life. I mean, Raul, do you remember he would come in, I would come in with a sermon. He loved slam poetry. I would tell him what the sermon was about, and in 5 minutes, he would write this awesome poem and read it like right before I would go up to preach. You remember him? Man, the guy was genius. I served under a pastor who was really smart, way smarter than I ever would be. The guy read books like crazy. I mean, he had all these books, and he would finish one book and start another. He wrote a couple books. But then there was one time I read a book, and I was like, you know what, man, Pastor Brandon could really get a lot out of this. And so I went up to him, I said, hey, you should read this book. I said, oh, yeah, I already read that one. I'm like, well, why haven't you applied it? Oh, well, I read this book, and I read that. He never applied any of it. And that's why to this day he's lost being a pastor. He's not even a pastor anymore. Divorced from his wife. Estranged from his kids. Because while he might have been really smart, he never applied wisdom to his life. So don't pray to be smart. Pray for wisdom and discernment. And so, where can you find, if you were going to seek wisdom, where are you going to find it? I want to give you 3 places. Okay? If I've convinced you through this story that you need to seek wisdom and discernment, where would you find it? Number 1, do what Solomon did and pray for it. Pray that God would give you wisdom. That's the first stop. Second stop is look throughout the pages of Scripture. Become really familiar with the Bible. There's several Bible studies happening at this church at all times. Attend them. Go through the book of Proverbs like the men's group has been doing. It's actually Solomon who collected wisdom that put it all together in 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs. And so what you can do is you can read a proverb each day of the month, and I'm telling you, God will give you wisdom through that. But the third place that I would recommend, and this is kind of a little off the wall, the third place I would tell you to seek wisdom is start pretending that you're stupid. Now, why do I say that? Because when I was younger, I never wanted anybody to think that I was stupid. I know none of you guys have ever done this, but I would get into these conversations with people, and people would start talking to me about some subject that I really wasn't familiar with, and they're like, oh, you're familiar with this subject? I'm like, oh, yeah, because I didn't want to look like I was stupid. But over the last 10 years, God's been changing, and I think it's also my age. Like, I really don't care what people think about me anymore, And so now, even if I have a little bit of understanding of a subject, if somebody brings it up, I'm like, no, I'm not familiar with it. Could you teach me? Could you tell me? And here's what's interesting is people don't think that you're stupid for doing that, because what they do is they go, wow, they're curious. And you start receiving this wisdom from all over the place. You know what? Nobody ever asks a rich person. Everybody always asks a rich person for a loan or for money or for a raise. They never ask rich people, hey, how did you do it? And this is what I found over the last 10 years. If you will go up to a person who's wealthy and just say, hey, how did you do it? They're more than welcome. They won't charge you for it because nobody ever asks them. If you want to be a great parent, this is something that I did. I was a youth pastor for 10 years at church. I was supposed to be the professional. I was supposed to be the one that went to school and everything. But you know what I would do? I had kids of my own, and whenever I would see a couple of teenagers that were really, really good, I would go up to their parents and be like, man, how did you do it? And I started collecting wisdom from all of these other parents and applying it to my kids. And here's what I'm going to tell you. If you want to be successful in life, seek wisdom and discernment. Pray for it. Bible. Start looking around at the people around you. Here's what I'm going to promise you. If you will do those three things, God will give it to you. Let's read our memorization verse for this week. I think this is the one that you guys should all know by memory. See if you can do it without looking at the screen. Matthew 6:33. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Seek wisdom and discernment. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for today. I thank you for this opportunity to worship you and to allow your word. Lord, I pray that this story is a story that we will remember for the rest of our lives. And Lord, not just because it's a crazy story with two prostitutes in it, but Lord, because it's a story that teaches us what's really valuable in this life. Lord, I pray that we would become a people who seek after wisdom and discernment. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.